All right, there we go. And as you can see, I'm going to continue with the theme that we started with last week. And I'm going to start with I think a little bit of a clarification, if not a retraction. And that is I'm setting this up in terms of two Americas, right? And we spoke a little bit about that last week. And I think that's a vast simplification and in important ways, therefore, a distortion as well. And in saying that, I mean in part that when I'm talking about the different economic fates of different individuals and families, of course, it's more diverse, more variegated than simply an America that's doing well and America that's left out, right? That there is a lot of gradations in between, as well as a lot of differences in how well you can do or how poorly you do. And so this is an ideal type, a simplification. It's meant to capture that for a substantial portion of the American population, the last, call it 40 years, feels like progress. And that was very much on display at the Democratic Convention. That is the dominant mood of the Democratic Party. And I think the fact that they found a candidate who seems to match both in her rhetoric and in the mood that she conveys as she campaigns, this sense that although the last 10 years have been hard, right? Call that the Trump era. You probably saw her use exactly that language in the interview she did on Thursday night on CNN, that we are ready to resume the march of progress that we've been on for the last 40 years. We've been interrupted by Donald Trump and his divisive and dour brand of politics has in many ways made many of us doubt whether we really are headed in a progressive direction or whether the long-standing experiment in American democracy, please note, we're less than 2 years away from, yeah, and we're past July 4th, the 250th anniversary of our Declaration of Independence, our founding as a country. In a sense, we tend to tell a story about ourselves that traces it back to 1776. Well, here we are about to hit 2026, right? It's quite phenomenal to think that we've sustained this project for this long, or maybe we haven't. There are very few polities that actually last that long. Maybe we are seeing the signs of advanced decay in American democracy. I think having Harris as the presidential candidate, both who she is and how she conducts herself and the mood that she manifests, helps us to feel, no, we're still forging ahead. And there's then another large segment of us who is inclined to believe that no, the last 40 years have not been progressive. They have been the opposite. They have been a series of setbacks by and for most of the workers who were the backbone of the American economy, for Christians, for the dominant racial group in our society for almost its entire history. And the result is that the narrative that the Democrats are telling is at best half the story. The more honest narrative would be to say that the experience of progress is reserved to people like you and has been denied people like me. And I don't want to hear about all this progress. I don't want to witness your celebration. That's just rubbing salt in my wounds. I am angry that you continue to tell this story 10 years into a period in which it should be obvious to you that many of us have been left out and that your progress has been purchased at the expense of our precariousness. And I will just very quickly say, I think Harris is trying in subtle ways to modify the way in which the narrative of progress is presented. And those modifications have to do with noting that there are people who are left out and indicating that we have to do better going forward. I wonder whether that's too tepid a message, whether ultimately, in the rather coarse contest of an election in which we get only two choices, right, in which therefore we are inclined to divide ourselves into two camps and to subscribe only to one of or the other of these narratives, whether trying to finesse the story a little bit is probably not going to be very satisfactory to those whose dominant experience of America in the 21st century is one of loss and insult, right? The idea that not only has their situation been damaged, but that the elite are so blissfully ignorant of how much damage they've suffered that they continue to stage these celebrations and subscribe to these narratives of progress. And so that's the reason for imposing this simplifying rubric on the complexity of American society. And please note, some of the people who are adherents of Donald Trump's MAGA brand of politics clearly have not been left out. Neither Trump nor Vance really count as people who've been left out, a billionaire and a multimillionaire. But having said that, they are not only representing the grievances, the anger, the resentment of those who feel they have been left out. In certain respects, they experience it themselves, right? The white billionaire from Queens, who, when he now goes back to his home borough, they're stripping his name from the golf courses because they don't like people like him, and there are not nearly so many people like him in Queens anymore. This is not Archie Bunker's or Donald Trump's Queens anymore. Or J.D. Vance, an Appalachian, who really feels that the reason that his people have sunk into addiction and suicide, deaths of despair, or generally dysfunctional behavior is in part because they've relinquished their religious values, the values that anchored them in a world that supported aspirations and ethics that were more functional in earlier periods in American history. So that there are racial and there are religious and there are gendered dimensions to this division as well. And of course, right, it's just so blatantly obvious when we look at the contrast between a very traditional white Anglo-Saxon Protestant man at the head of one party and a very 21st century cosmopolitan biracial woman who is the children of immigrants, not just on one side, but on both sides, mother and father, right? And so the idea that we really have two competing Americas, I'm tracing back today, and this is probably going to continue into the coming month, into different economic experiences in the United States in the 21st century. It's not only economic, it's racial, it's gendered, it's sexual, it's religious, and it's not only two. I just wanted to issue that clarification before I go further. But to show the relevance of this metric, and I have been talking with you guys, and it's a little humbling to think, for over a decade now. And so I've come to know you pretty well, and I'm inclined to think that most of us in this room, in this call together, um, are not particularly sympathetic to Donald Trump or the MAGA brand of politics, that we probably, many of us may not have been very sympathetic to the Republican Party before it took this turn almost a decade ago. But having said that, I do think it's essential that we have sufficient understanding, sufficient compassion or empathy to be able to understand the people who support Donald Trump and to be able to understand why they do so. That it's not just pure hate or spite or resentment, that there is a sense in which he is allowing them to feel respected, allowing them to feel visible, allowing them to feel hopeful in their own way, and that these are essential attributes of an effective leader in general, and especially in the media environment that we inhabit in the 21st century. And so to say that, I think then it is worthwhile noting, and I'm going to do as I tend to do in an election, to spend a little bit of time in with the polls, that this really is a dead heat. And I think that it may be the case that the polls are not capturing some of the complexity of this race, that just as the polls underestimated the appeal of Donald Trump in 2016, underestimated because they did not take into account the level of anger in American politics in the aftermath of the economic collapse of 2008 and all the damage it did, and the seeming unfairness of who the government assisted, the big banks, and who it didn't assist, the average homeowner, and the way in which that compounded the sense that so many of our resources were going to fighting foreign wars that we really didn't need to be fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that they were going there instead of assisting people who were losing their homes, who were seeing their jobs disappear, who were seeing their communities fray, who were seeing a rapid spread of an opioid epidemic and other forms of deaths of despair, that this was something that the polls took a while to catch up to. Right. And obviously this is an election like no other election, an election in which one candidate dropped out, in which another candidate survived an assassination attempt, right? In which we are still in the hangover of a global pandemic, but for the first time in many years, in many ways, resuming many aspects of normality. And so are there aspects of the mood that our polls are not catching up to fast enough? Might it be that Harris's brand of a more energetic, more joyful, I'm going to call it a more post-COVID, post-Trump brand of politics, right? You noticed the way, and she had said it before, but in the interview, she responded to Trump's challenging or belittling her racial self-identification by saying, same old stale story. Next question, move on, right? The sense that we are turning a corner, that Trump represents a brand of politics that might have made sense for us a decade ago. He won one election despite losing the popular vote. He doesn't deserve all of the attention we're paying to him. And we will be better and happier as a country if we put him in the rearview mirror. That may be right. And clearly, there are a bunch of focus groups and internal polls that the Harris campaign is using that suggest to her that this is the right way to respond to Trump: ignore, demean, or belittle rather than responding in kind. But having said that, I think we also need to at least give some credence to what the polls say. And what the polls say is that this race is a dead heat. Please note that Nate Silver has now shifted to favoring Trump, right? It's still a toss-up, but he believes, based on his model, that the best prediction in right late August of 2024 for what's going to happen in early November of 2024 is, and look at the electoral college votes, right? Obviously, essentially a tie, but maybe with a slight advantage to Trump. Why is that? Well, primarily because Pennsylvania has moved back into Trump's column, as has Nevada, North Carolina, Georgia, right? And that there's a cobbling together of enough states to get an electoral college victory. And please note, right, that part of what the Silver model does is to assign a post-convention bounce to Harris, right? And so the polls show Harris ahead in Pennsylvania. But if you believe part of that has to do with the fact that she just got, I don't know, a dozen hours of free primetime publicity as a result of having just concluded her convention, that she just did her first interview ever, that her campaign has in many ways bypassed the normal bumps in the road of a contested primary, but it's unlikely that for the next couple months she will continue to be able to have smooth sailing all the way to the end of the campaign. That once the convention bounce fades, once she has a debate and hits some difficulties and lots of negative advertisements start to work, some of what we're seeing in the polling will settle down to a place that makes this race a genuine dead heat. That means that she has exhausted her momentum. And so please note, right, how strong that momentum was for the first 3, 4 weeks she was in the campaign, but how it really did level out or plateau, and how it appears actually to be coming back down to earth a little bit on the Silver model. Now, I've tried to say to you many times, don't take these polls, these models as right anything but a distorted lens trying to see something that's a long ways off, a couple months away still. And so please note that the 538 model still gives Harris a slight edge, essentially the inverse of what Silver has, and that the economist model, and I'm just going to note this because I think it's funny, currently calls this race a dead heat, though it does give Harris a slight advantage in the Electoral College. I hope you can see the contrast with where Biden was in 2020, right, where Trump was in 2020. So clearly, Harris is running much closer to Trump in 2024 than Biden did in 2020. But having said that, I'll also note that 2 days ago, the economist model had Harris at 3 in 5 chance of winning. And that's in part because it moves in big jumps. It doesn't move in the small gradations of the Silver model. And in part because it's so responsive to changes in polls in Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, Nevada, Arizona, right? These are the states that this race is really going to come down to. Michigan, Wisconsin, if they become closer, will have even more of an impact on the polls. So if we want to try to get a slightly different window into this, I'll just suggest very quickly that another way to look at this is to look at a couple other metrics. One of them is voter registration, and this is some work done by a pollster, Tom Bonnier. I hope I'm saying his last name correctly. Probably not. That shows in the week after Harris entered the race in the swing states that Republican nomination, I'm sorry, Republican registration went up very modestly, 7 point, what is that, 8%, whereas overall registration went up by more than 30%, driven primarily by Democratic registration that went up by over 50% over the comparable prior period, and that African American women and Latino women were way out in terms of their numbers of 170% increase, 150% increase. And so again, if we're looking at energy, if we're looking at enthusiasm, if we're looking for metrics that might be a little bit more reliable than polls at predicting what's happening, voter registration might indicate that the energy shifted to Harris in late July. But having said that, and note that it's a little hard to get and to collate all this data because different states and even different counties within different states report this data at different times and in different ways. What we can see in North Carolina and Pennsylvania is that from early February through late July, the Republicans had a sizable advantage in registration in North Carolina, a more modest but still generally sustained advantage in Pennsylvania. And so, to put this differently, then, the good work that Harris is doing and the energy it reflects may have a fair bit of ground to cover before it catches up to what the deflated expectations on Biden were doing earlier in the year. Again, the financing continues to be yet another metric in which Harris is currently doing better than Trump. And this is entirely in terms of contributions to her campaign. Please note, if we were to look at super PAC contributions, which we really can't because the reporting on it is not nearly as good. A lot of it is dark money. What we would see is, I believe, that the Republicans are doing better than the Democrats. There's an interesting story to be told here about cryptocurrency millionaires and billionaires giving large amounts of money to the Trump campaign or Trump associated political action committees, in part because Trump has rather conveniently become pro crypto in this election. So, all of that to say, maybe a little bit better news for Harris, but I do think ultimately, and this comes back to scaling that empathy wall in Arlie Hochschild's language, right? The idea that the people in this room are so impressed with and so enthusiastic about Harris does not mean that Donald Trump isn't still an incredibly potent force in American politics and running a campaign despite all of its missteps and stumbles that is essentially running neck and neck with Harris. And that pulls me back to this idea that what Harris is selling, the way in which she is framing her campaign, the energy and mood that she brings to bear, the issues that she focuses on are powerful for half of America and repellent or discordant to the other half of America. And so that's where I want to go today. I'm going to use a different way of thinking about this for a moment. And so you will recognize this is something we talked about last week, but I've added to the slide a book that's very influential and that I like a lot by Jay McCloyd. I don't know if you can see the color, but Jay McCloyd, who wrote this very influential sociological study in the, I think, mid 1980s, is now a vicar in the Anglican Church in England, right? So he's not doing the kind of work that got him a lot of regard 20, 30, 40 years ago. But I want to talk about that work nevertheless. And I'll just note in passing, because I think it's interesting, that this was actually his undergraduate thesis at Harvard University. He developed it to turn it into the book, and among other things, he was awarded a Rhodes Scholarship. He went off to England and basically didn't really come back, right? So having said all of that, the book reflects McCoy's time, a couple of years that he spent in the housing projects of South Boston. And in those projects, he identified two main racial groups, Irish Americans and African Americans. And in particular, he spent a lot of time with the high school age boys or young men from those two groups. And he noticed some really stark contrasts between them. In particular, the Irish Americans were not serious about school. They were playing hooky a lot. They belonged to street gangs, not big criminal enterprises, but they hung out on the streets. They liked certain sports and other recreational activities more than they liked school. And they were not being encouraged by their parents to go to school, at least not in a way that led them to mend their behavior. The African American boys were, many of them, much more serious about school and much more hopeful that if they did well in high school, they would be able to go to community college or a college or university that would actually allow them to succeed better in life than their parents had. And they were getting encouragement and thinking that from especially their parents and their elders. And so McCoy interviewed a bunch of the Irish kids and in particular some of them who he thought of as being quite bright, quite promising, and he really wanted to understand, look, why aren't you working as hard as you could? Why aren't you working up to your potential? Don't you recognize that you would have opportunities if you applied yourself? And McCloyd himself may have identified somewhat with the Irish boys. He was very close in age and from a similar background. And the Irish kids said to him, Irish American kids said to him very clearly in a phrase that became the title to his book, there ain't no making it, right? And what they meant is, look, our great grandparents migrated to this country for opportunity. And it is absolutely true that they are no longer working the potato fields of Northern Ireland anymore. But it is also the case that for three generations, we've been, right, house painters, carpenters, bartenders, mechanics working the docks. We have stalled in our rung on the American ladder of opportunity. This is a stratified society in the language of sociology, and we are stuck in our strata. And not only that, we've been told by our parents, this is the one period in your life where you don't have to work hard, where you don't actually have to work yourself right to the bone in order to support your family doing backbreaking physical labor. So enjoy yourself in school. And by the way, school is a hostile environment. They're going to hear your accent. They're going to take one look at you and they're going to stereotype you. They're going to know who you are and that you're not the kind of kid who does well in school. Don't take them seriously. Their parents, in many ways, were trying to protect them in terms of their self-esteem and the experience of school as an environment that tended to devalue and undermine people like them, right? So McCoy came up with a term to describe the working class Irish boys he was studying: leveled aspirations. They don't think they can aspire to anything higher than what their parents already have, and so they're not trying. He then turned to the African American boys, and he found that their experience was quite different, right? That the African American boys had grandparents or parents who had migrated from the Jim Crow South to Boston. And it was absolutely the case that they were encountering racism, stereotypes, discrimination, and prejudice in Boston. Please remember, I probably didn't mention this actually. McCoy was writing this book or doing this research in the early 1980s, maybe late 1970s. And at that point, right, Boston was torn apart by school integration. And if you remember your history, right, the buses that were taking the black kids into the white schools were being pelted with rocks. People were trying to put things in their way to barricade their progress. Fires were being lit. And so there was no, I think, illusion about the idea that this was a totally different world from what they had left in the South. But nevertheless, when their parents came from the South, they came from Jim Crow. They came from sharecropping. They came from lynching. They came from a society in which whites could do criminal violence to them with total impunity because the racist legal justice system of the South never successfully prosecuted white people for raping or murdering black people, etc., and so on. And so their parents' experience was one of progress, was one of having escaped from a bad situation and arrived at a better situation. And they implanted in their children the belief that in America, with hard work, with courage, with good luck, you can do better. And I point to this study because it seems to me in many ways this is in a very small story the bigger narrative of the two Americas I'm trying to convey to you, right? The idea that in the 21st century, a large portion of America has come to have the leveled aspirations that McCoy found in a small group of Irish working class kids, right? Irish American working class kids. And that another portion of America has the aspiration for upward mobility still intact, in part based on the experiences of watching Raphael Warnock now become one of the most powerful political figures in the formerly segregated Jim Crow state of Georgia, having watched Pete Buttigieg go from being a closeted gay man to an openly married gay man who has a leadership role in a presidential cabinet and in his party in various ways, right? I mean, we can take Harris and Obama as well. Children of immigrants, in Harris's case, as she tells the story at least, working class originally, who have risen to become very successful, very powerful, perhaps on the cusp of being among the most powerful people in our society. Those people feel that the American dream is still intact. This is still a progressive society. This is still a society in which working hard pays off. And they view everything in the society through the lens of progress, whereas the other camp views everything in our society through the experience of stagnation, growing vulnerability and disrespect, which they feel the last 20 to 40 years have represented for them. And the result is that they see crime and disorder and moral decay where the other America, Harris's America, the Democrats' America, sees movement in terms of new values, new freedoms, new liberties, new economic opportunities, and that if we belong to the first camp or the second camp, and we only look through the distorting lens that our experience suggests we study our society through, we are blind. We fail to understand where the other side is coming from. They look just deranged, crazy. How could they support Donald Trump? Don't they see he's a billionaire who did nothing for them and who will say whatever he thinks they want to hear, that he's an inveterate liar and a man of low morals, claiming to be the savior of their traditional religious values? Don't they see that his policies actually benefit his billionaire cronies more than they benefit ordinary people? Obviously, I'm dwelling on the Democratic or Harris side of the divide because I know that's where we tend to be. But having said that, I think when we fail to extend empathy to the other side, fail to recognize that there's an integrity, a logic, a coherence to the way in which they experience the world, and it is rooted in their experience in this society over the last 20 or 40 years, we do not only them but ourselves a disservice. We don't understand how it's possible that Donald Trump is going to win this election, that the Republicans are going to hold the House and retake the Senate. And I just want to be as clear as possible. I think it's one thing to understand the other side, it's another thing to know what to do in terms of policy and politics and culture and society to bridge the gap, to try to bring them closer to an understanding of America that makes the progress seem credible and makes us seem less indifferent to them. I do want to get there, and I do want to evaluate Harris's policies from that perspective. So let me move on. And I want to start with something that I'll be very brief about. And I have on the board some ideas indebted to the Italian political theorist who's been teaching at Columbia University for the last 20 years, writes very often in English now, Nadia Urbanati. And I think of her as one of the foremost and most interesting theorists of populism. And I think part of what makes her so effective in dissecting and explicating the way populist politics works, well, it's in part that she's Italian. And so having had not only Mussolini, but especially Silvio Berlusconi in her recent history, right? And please note the very strong parallels between Berlusconi and Trump, both coming out of a media environment, both populist leaders, both facing sustained criminal inquiries or difficulties. Having said all of that, I think this makes her maybe prescient in the American context. She saw Trump coming. She saw populism coming. She understands it better than many Americans have. And in particular, she treats populism as an alternative interpretation of democracy. It's not just that the populists and Project 2025 and Donald Trump and J.D. Vance want to use executive power to do what we think Viktor Orban did, which is to overturn democracy, they take seriously. They are intellectually persuaded. There is a political theory that suggests that what Viktor Orban did was not to destroy democracy, but to replace an outmoded and deficient brand of democracy with a superior 21st century brand of democracy, and that what we need in the 21st century is illiberal, is conservative, is Christian nationalist democracy, as opposed to the liberal democracy that in many ways is responsible for our country having gone off the rails for the last 50 years at least. And so then very quickly, I want to suggest, right, that this vision of illiberal, populist, conservative democracy is what is being offered, at least by J.D. Vance or Steve Bannon or some of the political theorists and the more intelligent representatives of this new MAGA movement. And so it's worth our while to understand how this is understood as responding to the economic experience of decline, of growing precariousness, of surrendering the prosperity of the middle of the 20th century and allowing immigrants and women and liberals to put us on a path that took us away from the economic security that was characteristic of the working class experience of the middle of the 20th century. That's a, I think, distorted narrative, but it's a distorted narrative that has enough plausibility, enough subjective validity, enough of a capacity to articulate the feeling, structure, and experience of a large swath of the American populace that it is convincing to many people. So how do populists conceive of democracy? Well, they want to suggest that the liberalism and pluralism that in many ways have been reflected since Madison, but especially in the middle of the 20th century, and then again under Obama, with American constitutional democracy, are a mistake, right? That they make too much room for internal diversity, debate. This is what I emphasized, right, about the Democratic nominating convention last week, that it displayed, it was proud of the differences within the party. It gave room and time to air those differences, in part because the Democratic Party is united around opposing Trump, but in part because this is the conception of democratic politics that implicitly informs the Democratic Party. We should not expect everyone to unify around a single leader and forget their differences in order to fall in lockstep behind his lead. Whereas, right, the populist model tends to suggest that the different view of leadership is appropriate, that what we want is a single leader who understands the true people of our country, who may be the majority, but who clearly were not uniform, but those people who are dissident, those people who are expressing other views, they're not legitimate. They're not to be tolerated or given space to articulate their ideas. They are the enemies of the people, and we need to recognize them as such and do our best to protect them ourselves from them, right? And so, right, the pluralist understanding of partisanship, that we have two parties because we have diverse views, and when we represent members from both parties, we ask them to work with each other, to compromise, to compete, yes, but that competition is productive because it allows us to draw on the insights of competing views. No, there's one true, one right way to represent the true people, and those who do not fall into line with the true people's leaders, well, they are enemies. So we divide the world into friends and enemies. This makes populism prone to what's called Caesarism, to an autocratic leader taking over and holding on to power in the way that Donald Trump evidently tried to do on January 6th, or in the aftermath of having lost the election of 2020, right? And it makes populists impatient with deliberation, with compromise, with the committee system. They prefer what is called in this literature decisionism, somebody who is decisive, who uses their will to simply impose their ideas, their policy, even their understanding of reality, right? And so one of the things you hear from Donald Trump a lot is trust me, right? And used as a way to assert a matter of fact that appears to be contrary to what a lot of the evidence suggests is actually the fact, right? And so the idea that we don't want, or populists don't need, the ordinary mechanisms of accumulating evidence, of letting communities of inquiry figure out by debates and pluralism within themselves what we should ultimately believe, but that instead we substitute for our own judgment the judgment of a single strong leader. And so that view, I want to suggest, gets strong support from two things rooted in the economic experience of so many Americans. One of them is that the world has become more complicated, has become more dangerous, has become more hostile for people like us, that we need someone who is strong enough to navigate the difficulties and the hostility of the world. And that requires that we throw in behind somebody who has the requisite strength, vigor, dominance to do for us what we may not be able to do for ourselves, master a hostile and increasingly chaotic world. And then you add to that the idea, well, you're talking about defending all of these procedures, right? Please note, for instance, on the immigration debate, Harris has come round to a much more conservative position. She's trying, I think, to meet the mood of the American electorate about immigration. I am not especially sympathetic to that mood, nor to what seems to me to underlie it, which is an understanding of our genuine economic difficulties as rooted in high levels of immigration. I think that actually gets things exactly wrong. But having said that, right, I'm a small minority. And the majority of Americans seems to have concluded that we have a problem with immigration, that we have too many people entering the country, in particular, too many people entering the country without legal permission or documentation to do so, that they are competing with us for our jobs, for our housing, that they're overtaxing our municipal services, our schools, our healthcare systems, and that we need stronger use of authority to protect ourselves from them. The debate between Harris and Trump, right? One of them is um, how much cruelty should be used to meet the threat. And clearly Harris believes in what I want to call a more humane immigration policy. Trump believes in what he wants to call a more muscular and effective immigration policy. But I think that the fundamental dispute is really about how to do this, because what Harris is saying is, look, there was good legislation fleshed out in the Senate. And by good, she means aggressive, conservative legislation that would restrict the ability of many immigrants to get here, that would in particular tighten up our asylum system and prevent people from coming here who had not applied in other countries to seek asylum. And Trump is saying back to her, why do you need legislation? When I was president, I did it with executive power. And what Harris is not saying so far is, well, Biden is doing it with executive power now, right? And so yes, in the 21st century, executive power is important, but how important should it be? And how much should we rely on what I'll call executive decree, right? The use of the power of a single individual as opposed to the legal process of hashing out a new law and all the compromise and deliberation, horse trading that involves to get conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats and even an independent on board supporting the same piece of legislation. And for Harris, I think that remains the model of how law is supposed to be made and then enforced. And for Trump, he's impatient with it, right? And this represents a mistrust of the process of making law, not only as ill suited to the complexity, the fast moving nature of 21st century society, but also as corrupt, as rigged, as captured. And I want to suggest that that sense that American politics, in particular, that legislation, that Congress is now simply so corrupted that we cannot rely on it anymore, is rooted deeply in economic legislation from the last roughly 40, 45 years, and in particular, the role of government in bringing about the economic era that has been so damaging to so many Americans. We call this the neoliberal economic era. It's got a shift to more minimal governmental function in the economy, less regulation, less taxation, less industrial policy, less welfare. And this coincided, it's not identical with, but I do think that in many ways it facilitated and accelerated the transition in the United States into a post-industrial, much more financialized and globalized form of capitalism. And the result has been vastly growing inequality and many more Americans kicked out of jobs that they viewed as very good lifetime jobs and put into jobs that they view as much less advantageous to them or no jobs whatsoever, that many Americans as a result don't have the income to keep up with the rising cost of living, with their increased expenses. They're relying more on debt. The bankruptcy law has changed. They now get plenty of offers for credit cards, which allow them to keep up with their rising expenses and to engage in some compensatory consumption. I don't feel economically secure. I don't feel respected, but at least I can get a new car, a new phone, a new computer, a new TV because I've got a credit card with a good a good credit limit. I've got the financing from the Ford dealership. And then when you can't pay all those bills, you also can't escape them. They will levy your bank account. They will levy your paycheck. If you aren't careful, they may even try to take your house, right? And that this is the meanness of the contemporary economy. I'm not going to go into all of the details here, but let me, for a moment, just move on to the next theme that I want to emphasize, which is that this economic change, this change into this more competitive, riskier, meaner economy, this economy that seems to generate much greater inequality, much greater precariousness for the losers, and luxury for the winners, didn't just come about of its own accord. There is a rich literature in contemporary economics, political science, sociology, legal theory that shows how the state actively aided and abetted the creation of this new economy and did so through treaties, through innovations in contract and finance law, through new precedent in judicial decision making, that we've moved into a winner take all society in part because of the way in which the state shapes the economy through law. And so this sense, you want now to rely on Congress to make new laws to help us with the difficulties we're experiencing in the middle of the 21st century? No, thank you. Congress is the institution that got us to where we are. We no longer trust Congress or the model of politics that says we should be diversely represented. There should be people who are Republicans and people who are Democrats, people from rural agrarian communities and people from the urban cosmopolitan cities of the United States. We should have people who represent the religiously conservative and people who represent the new professional classes that don't seem to have much time for religion at all. Bring them all together in Congress and get them talking to each other, and we'll do better at solving our problems than if we simply try to impose our will on each other. Where did that get us? The cacophony, the disagreement, the paralysis allowed the lobbyists, the rich, to capture this institution and to do things with it that are bad for almost all of us. Let's give up on that naive conception of politics and move closer to the populist model that seems at least to give us some satisfaction in recognizing the harm that neoliberalism has done to us, and maybe even some relief by pursuing policies that may protect us going into the 21st century. So I hope the framework is now clear what it is I'm trying to suggest to you. And I think I will stop there for today in order to give you some time for comments or questions. but I want to get into in subsequent lectures more details, and in particular, details about the economic policies being proposed by the two candidates about, on the one hand, tariffs and deportations, on the other hand, subsidizing the construction of affordable housing and imposing higher taxes on the wealthy. We'll need to talk in detail about whether either of those policy proposals is adequate on its own, sufficient to address the conditions that it tries to address, and also about what likelihood there is that they would actually be implemented and have any effect at all. That's where we're going. I've been trying to establish the basic framework from which to do that. Who wants to start us out with a comment, a thought? As you can see, I'm pivoting a little bit back away from the day-to-day of the campaign and the conventions, in part because last week was a relatively quiet week in our politics, in part because, well, I think it's productive not only to focus on the horse race, but to also try to focus on some analysis that allows us a little bit deeper insight, I hope. David, I can't tell. Are you really wearing a hat?
I am wearing a hat. I'm outside on the balcony because it's a very nice day.
Nice.
Yeah,
And
but
and
it's
on
also
the other
sunny.
hand, what do you have in the background? It's not the
Uh,
campaign,
it
is
is
it?
the Campanile, and it's an accident. I usually have the Golden Gate Bridge, but somehow I managed to inadvertently change the background. But
Well,
what I wanted to say was that I have a different theory about what drives the resentment against American politics by poor whites. And my theory is that the neoliberalism that's characterized both Republican and Democratic, uh, you know, uh, government, starting with, I guess, Reagan and through Bush and Clinton and even Obama, and is that uh, they resent, they place the boogeyman or the sacrificial bad person for poor whites are giveaway programs to minorities and immigrants, and that they don't understand that neoliberalism is an enemy toward all people who are low on the economic scale, and that neoliberalism puts them in the same category as poor blacks and poor minorities, all of whom don't have a chance to take advantage of the American dream because all the benefits are going to the top 5 or even 1% of the economic distribution, and that there's two P. You could either blame neoliberalism or you could play giveaway. You could blame big giveaway programs to poor minorities and immigrants, and that's what I hear from people is that these people have stolen our birthright, and
and
it's all been because those damn coastal liberals have given them the money, and they want to get rid of. They don't really want to get rid of Medicare or They just, or I mean, of Obamacare. They just they just want to tell people it's a bad thing and then benefit from the advantages that it does give them. So and I don't know how you develop a narrative where you make the top 1% or 5% of the of the economic distribution the bad guy rather than the coastal liberals and minorities and immigrants.
yeah, thank you for that, David. And I think I completely agree with what you're saying. And when I get there, it's part of the attraction of Trump's politics, right? The idea that he's saying round them up and deport them. He's saying stop giving those illegal immigrants the advanced place in the line that should be going to ordinary Americans. And there's frankly a vile narrative in which, right, Democrats are allowing them into the country in order to accelerate their registration to vote in order to get reelected, right? In addition to the idea that they're
Right.
stealing economic opportunities. And then we add to that, look at what is being said against Harris. And so she's a DEI candidate, right? What does that mean? Well, it really means she got affirmative action, right? This is the new language, that the only reason that Harris is the vice president is not that she deserved to be, not that she was the most capable choice available to Joe Biden, but that Joe Biden, like all the other Democrats, believe in allowing a less qualified Black woman to jump the queue to opportunity. And then he's adding, and she's not that smart. She's dumb. She didn't even pass the California bar the first time round, right? Somebody more qualified was passed over to give an opportunity to somebody less qualified because that's the racial politics of the Democrats in the 21st century, right? And so, yes, this is implicitly and explicitly, absolutely the way in which the Republicans are campaigning. And I go back to, I like a lot Arlie Russell Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land and her study of Southern Louisiana. She has a new book coming out. I think it's going to be published in a month or two. And she's looking at another rural community, but this image she came up with, right? That the good, hardworking white people of our country had been lining up for generations to get into the land of opportunity, and that there had been slow but steady progress in that march in the direction of prosperity, and that the line stopped, right, at a certain point in recent history. And then not only did it stop, but you started to get pushed backwards because other people were cutting into the line. Those people were Black and brown, and it was the government who was forcing them into the line ahead of you. Now, having said all of that, right? And so it's a way of scapegoating immigrants. It's a way of scapegoating Africans. It's a way, African Americans, I'm sorry. It's a way of also indicating that there's been a betrayal of you by the party you used to trust, FDR's New Deal party, which really did help you in the past. Well, the Democrats are now on the side of other people. And so that's where the Republican Party is going to step in and have your back. I don't dispute any of that. I just think it's really part of the same narrative. And so, yes, the story I'm telling involves also noticing NAFTA, also noticing the anti-unionization legislation in many southern states, also noting the way in which the banks and Wall Street are able to trade in mortgage backed securities because the FEC allows them to, and the courts actually enforce these contracts, and laws enabled these new financial instruments. And, noticing that the banks got bailed out in 2008, 2009, and family home owners didn't. And you put all of this together, and there's a racial dimension to it, and an economic dimension to it, and a religious dimension to it, and a gender dimension to it. It's where I started today. I have to be careful of an over simple narrative. But I'm also talking about American politics where we truck in simple narratives, right? And so I am trying to indicate the more complicated social reality that is then simplified through scapegoating narratives in our politics. Thank you, David. Useful in drawing out some of what I left out and some of the implications of this approach. Hannah, you've been waiting for a while. Go ahead. Are you unmuted?
Yeah, yes. My issue is maybe more primitive than that. All of these arguments are just fine, but they're ivory tower discussions as far as that populist group is concerned. Our candidate has got to get out, look in public, and be seen. Trump has made it very clear that the person at the head is the most important thing. People look at him. They look at him with his 20 flags and his whatever. Pomp and circumstance means a lot to a lot of people in this country. And frankly, there is no way that the general population has the slightest concept of who Kamala Harris is. She has got to get out there. She's got to give informal interviews, not just formal ones, talk to the press, talk to the population. Then we can start talking about these issues that David has presented.
Thank you, Hannah. And I'm going to use the phrase retail politics, right? You know, shaking hands, talking, and again, you know, you have to give it to Donald Trump. He will give any news outlet that wants to talk with him an interview, right? And so he's not just talking to CNN or Fox News, which he talks to Fox News an awful lot, but he's also talking to the local ABC affiliate in rural Pennsylvania. And frankly, sometimes he's getting himself in trouble by, you know, just saying whatever it is he thinks they want to hear or whatever it is he thinks is advantageous. He's neither disciplined nor consistent, right? But having said that, he is accessible. And Harris is not. And Harris is clearly, and I was watching that interview Thursday night, and I was thinking to myself, I'm certainly not alone, that she's a prosecutor, right? That's her fundamental formative political experience. What do prosecutors do? They ask the questions. They're not the witness. And in a sense, being interviewed puts you in the witness position, right? And she doesn't like being in that position. She wasn't terrible, but she was stilted and stiff and gave answers that clearly were highly rehearsed and didn't seem very spontaneous. My hope is that she will get better at this. But I will also say that one of the things about being an effective politician is knowing what you do well and doing it, and also knowing what you do poorly and avoiding it to the maximum degree possible, right?
But
So,
it's not only getting elected. It's,
yeah,
you know, she will not be in the position of always asking the questions. But it just, the more she practices, the more she talks to people, the more relaxed she will get about it and not feel that every time she greets a reporter, she has to give all kinds of policy things. She can simply say, I'm on my way to buy a new pair of shoes or something, and become a human being to
yeah.
the American public, which she is not now.
Yeah, she tried just a little bit telling the story of how she was cooking pancakes for her grandnieces when Biden gave her the call. But no, she clearly needs to work on this. And by the way, she also needs to get ready for the debate. And she also needs to do a lot of fundraising. And she also needs to put together a policy portfolio. She is thrown into the fire with very little right time to get ready to handle the situation. And that doesn't forgive her from not doing what she needs to do to win this election. But having said that, I do have a certain amount of sympathy for the idea that she is doing an awful lot all at the same time. Flossie,
I remember my friend Mike Dukakis making the same mistake.
Yes, yes. I didn't know Mike Dukakis was your friend. I met him a couple times too. Interesting guy. Go ahead, Flossie.
Two moments of truth. May they ring. Two moments that gave me joy. when the Obamas kissed each other. That was a moment of truth. It was a real kiss. It was real bliss. We all need that kind of devotion. The other thing that gave me joy occurred outside the convention when a Solon of sorts, a man of some dignity, was so angry that he declared this was before Biden stepped out of the picture. He said that he would vote for Biden even if Biden were dead. And it rang like a bell. He need not say any more. He would vote for Biden even if Biden were dead because the opponent was dead ahead of everyone else. You will dispute this with me, but they were moments of joy.
I
And
don't
I
want to.
carry them with me every time I think there's no hope for the human race. I imagine the triumphant, I do this even if, and the moment of a kiss. Thank you.
And I'm not going to dispute it, Flossie.
Okay,
I'm
good.
gonna add to your little lockbox of hopeful moments. How's that? So
Yes.
Tim Walls's son, right?
Yes.
You know, in tears. That's my dad. That's my dad. I thought that was such a beautiful moment. Um,
I agree.
and the image of Kamala Harris's niece, or is it grandniece, right? Looking up at her aunt, right? The beautiful little ponytails. And so yeah, that there are moments like that distill for us some good pure emotions that can still be realized in American politics. And I think that might be a nice note to wrap up on today. Am I right? There wasn't anybody else eager to make a comment right now? Then let's focus on finding those little tokens of hope and joy in our politics, despite how messy and vicious it can be. All right, everybody. Wonderful being with you. Be well. And I will see everybody next week to continue the conversation. Thank you for the good insights as well at the end today. Take care, everyone. See you next week. Thank you. Bye bye.
And I'm sorry I missed your real presence when you were here
Oh,
a couple of weeks ago.
I'm sorry too, but there will be another opportunity. I'll be back in December after
Okay.
all this is done to see you guys in person again. Take
Okay.
care. Be well.
David, David,
Yes.
we still need the link for tomorrow.
Okay, Ann. Let me make sure I get that to you, okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you,
Bye,
David.
everybody.